All right, welcome. In this video, I want to explore the area of evolutionary algorithms. So an evolutionary algorithm is going to try and employ the power of evolution to evolve a population of agents. In our last video, we talked about how these agents should be bearing some kind of information, like in humans we use, or biological systems, we have DNA. And the goal of the evolutionary algorithm is typically to create something, engineer something in some sense. So there's some goal, usually specific goal, that we want this agent or program or entity to carry out. And we're going to try, instead of using a typical way of programming, which is to deliberately create the behaviors that you want, we're instead going to indirectly try and evolve those behaviors using the evolutionary algorithm to try and steer behaviors towards our stated goal. In evolutionary algorithms, there are lots of different ways that we might encode that information that's going to evolve. So because computers are information processing tools, almost all that they deal with are information, and we have lots of different ways that we can store that information in different formats. So when we're deciding what kind of information we want to use for our evolutionary algorithm, what information do we want to be able to replicate and therefore maybe change according to the rules of evolution, we have to decide, well, what is that information going to be? So here I've got just some examples out of context for the moment. So context meaning a specific purpose that we're trying to build an evolutionary algorithm for, but in general we might find out an artificial genomes out there that are the very simplest, might just be a sequence of bits, of binary strings, zeros and ones, and we might have simple mutation operations that might flip a bit and change 0 to a 1 and so on, and there might be more complicated ones as well. That's a very simple kind of genome, but making it a little bit more complicated is we might, instead of having a sequence of bits, we could have a sequence of numbers, where those numbers are not just limited to being one bit, but could be maybe an integer, and by that I mean a formal integer data type, like maybe a 32-bit integer, or a long and maybe a 64-bit integer and so on, maybe even a big integer, or maybe a double. We might use doubles and floats to represent in case we don't just have whole numbers. And so it's very common for us to maybe encode a genome as a list of these numerical parameters. And for simplicity, let's assume we've got some agent that maybe has height and weight and strength and hunger and a couple other properties that we think might be controlled by their genes. Well, we might then assign specific numerical parameters to each of those values that might determine that agent's values, and hopefully those numbers impact its survival and reproduction in whatever algorithm you're putting it to, so that evolution can take hold. What other things could we have? Well, we could have a string of characters as our genome, which is definitely inspired from DNA. DNA is not a string of characters, but when we abstract away some of the chemical properties and we think of the DNA as a code that's encoding something, then we do kind of think of it as a string of characters. In DNA, we use G, A, T, and C, which are the first letters of the names of the chemicals that are involved in DNA. And so we can sometimes abstract away DNA. It's not chemicals anymore. It's just a string. It's just a string of G's, A's, T's, and C's, in the same way that a binary string is just a string of zeros and ones. And so we can take that inspiration and build artificial genomes that also have that property, that they are a string. We can have more complicated genomes. So the next one on my list here is a solution to a problem. So it's common, one of the things we might be trying to use evolutionary algorithms for is to solve a standard computational problem. And what we might do is we might just randomly generate solutions to that problem to start out initially, and then we will evaluate those solutions and decide how good they are. This is really good for like minimization or maximization problems, optimization problems, where we're trying to seek something that's the best. In that case, we could evaluate all of our problems and see which ones are the best and keep those ones around. Those solutions, maybe filter out or kill off the ones that are not very good solutions, and then maybe we interbreed or mutate the good solutions to try and hopefully get even better solutions. So this is a very common way to solve hard problems. Without trying to directly solve the problem, we will just keep looking for better and better solutions. And sometimes this is called a population-based search. Something that I'm going to spend more time talking about in a future video is the idea that we can also evolve artificial neural networks. And artificial neural networks are very sophisticated AI tools that can be used for a number of different important tasks. They're quite good these days at classifying. And because they're good at classifying, that means looking at an image maybe, or looking at some text and deciding what it is or what it's about. Neural nets have got really good at that, and in recent years we've also used them to start becoming controllers for robots. And artificial neural networks are used in self-driving cars and other types of technology like that. So evolving neural networks so that they can perform important tasks for us is another area that evolutionary algorithms is employed in, and we're going to take a look at how we do that to maybe evolve simple controllers for robots in a future video. Finally, you can actually evolve programs, and we looked at that in a past video when we talked about Tierra, a artificial life experiment, where they actually evolved programs inside memory. And evolving programs is a little bit harder because coming up with the mechanisms of mutation and crossover for programs can be very challenging. But there is still a lot of interesting research being done in this area. And these aren't the only options. I leave us here saying that we could use any kind of container of information to store our, as long as it bears information and we have rules of mutation and recombination to allow it to have some variety. We could use almost any kind of container of information. And so for that reason, evolutionary algorithm designers are free to use any of these models, but also just make up their own whenever they feel like it might be useful for their purpose or task at hand. So in order to understand artificial evolution and evolutionary algorithms a little bit better, I want to do a case study, and this is a fairly simple case study. It's definitely a program that you could write yourself. I have regularly used this as an assignment in my data structures class for junior students who are, junior computer science students who are trying to learn how to use different data structures. This one can be carried out quite simply with lists of strings. So if you want to, practice and get a little bit of familiarity with evolutionary algorithms, follow along here. I've kind of got the specs here in this video of how you can design it. So my idea is we're going to evolve a population of strings. So strings just being, strings of characters. And I'm going to try and evolve it to spell my name. So down here in my example here, there's my name, Christopher Paul Marriott. That's my full name. And we're going to start out with small strings, maybe that have no characters in it, and we're going to apply the principles of evolution, or we're going to try and design an evolutionary algorithm that the target or the goal of the evolution is to spell my name, not anyone else's name. And so we're going to maintain a population of strings, and we're going to evolve them eventually, hopefully, until they spell my name. So I've decided to limit the characters that I'm going to use for my evolution to just these characters here, A, B, C, D, up to Z, and the space character. If your name happens to have other characters and you want to include it, you can go ahead and do that in your code. Maybe add an apostrophe or a hyphen, or maybe you have special characters because your name is not natively from English. If that's the case, go ahead and add some extra characters in there. But for my purposes, I thought just the standard alphabet, all capitals, you'll notice here, no lowercase. One of the reasons is if I add more characters to this set, it makes it harder for us to evolve the name, meaning it might take longer, more generations, more iterations for us to get there. And so I've tried to restrict ourselves to a small number of characters, realistic set of characters that might be used in this kind of purpose. So that's our setup there. Our genomes are just going to be strings, and they're going to be comprised of the characters from this set. All right, so I've been hinting that we're going to need to maintain a population of strings if we're going to do this. So in evolutionary algorithms, we need to have a population of agents. We can't just have a single agent. A single agent by itself cannot evolve. We need a population to be able to do evolution. And so we need to decide on how big that population is. And as I mentioned, a single agent by itself is not usually enough to get evolution going. And for that matter, a small group of agents, maybe 2, 4, 5, and so on, is not enough to actually get evolution going as well. There's not enough variety in that population for selection to really take hold. And so what we want to do is have a population that is going to be big enough for us to get some evolution going on, but maybe not too much bigger than that. Why not? Well, we have computational limitations when we are employing evolutionary algorithms. If you make your population too big, it's just going to take a long time. And so there's this trade-off between how much time it's going to take and how big we need to get it just to get some efficient evolution to take hold. So that's one idea. The other idea I got here is that we need to decide if our population is going to end up having a fixed size or a variable size. A fixed size means maybe we pick a population of size 100 and it's always a size of 100. Every generation there's only 100 agents. We never get more or less. A variable size population is one where that population might change from generation to generation. And this is more common in natural selection type algorithms where maybe the behavior of the agents determines how rapidly they can reproduce. And if they can reproduce more rapidly, their population is going to grow. And if they reproduce more slowly, maybe their population will sink. And this might be in response to variable resource availability in their environment or some other characteristic. So we need to decide for our strings, should we make a fixed population, and if so, what size? And otherwise, should we have a variable population? And if so, what would be the initial size of our population? We still need to decide on an initial size. For our simulation, where we're going to evolve strings to spell my name, this is a fairly simple experiment that we can build in some artificial population limits. So for instance, I think this is somewhat arbitrary. I'm just going to pick 100 strings for my population size. I could have picked 50, I could have picked 200, I could have picked 134. These are just really arbitrary choices. I pick 100 because 100 is a nice round number in base 10 that we all kind of like, and it's certainly going to be big enough for us to do our evolution, and it's definitely not going to be too big for us. It's not going to slow us down. We could definitely increase the size over this and still be pretty rapid. So I've sort of hinted at the idea of a generation. That is, our evolutionary algorithm is going to move ahead in time, going one generation at a time, trying to, hopefully, again, as I mentioned, evolve towards our target. So when we switch from one generation to the next, we might have our initial generation of strings that maybe we randomly generate, or maybe we have some strategy for how we generate them. Maybe they're all empty strings, or they all start out as Chris or something like that. So we'll start out with that initial population. Then we need to decide, how do we move to the next generation? What do we do? And so here are a few possibilities. These aren't the only ones, but these are some of the common ones. One thing we do is we might replace the entire generation. So the whole population after generation 1 gets killed off, and a whole new generation of offspring might emerge. This is often very common in sort of seasonal plant-like evolution, where you might have one generation that is sort of born in the spring, it grows, it produces its seeds in the fall, the seeds fall down and then are dormant during the winter, and then they take root, and the next generation, the one that takes hold the next spring, are all new seeds. They're all completely new. There are no plants from the last year that are still around. They've all died. All the new plants are a new generation. This kind of fixed full replacement structure is a very standard structure in evolutionary algorithms because it's easy to do. Okay, an alternative to that, so that's sort of a severe one where we replace everyone dies. Okay, an alternative to that is that we only replace a very small group of group of agents every iteration or generation. Say in our population size of 100, that might mean we only pick like 5, and we kill 5 off, the 5 worst ones usually, but sometimes in steady state models we might just kill 5 randomly. And then we replace those 5 with 5 new ones. Now this is a good strategy when you want to make sure that you preserve anything good that's in your evolution. So when we destroy a whole population, yeah, we're usually going to generate the next generation from that population. But if we destroy the whole one, if there was a really good agent in the last generation, there might not be a good copy of them in the next generation. They may have mutated enough or crossovered enough in the next generation that they're not good anymore. And so it's often a good idea to keep some of the old generation around in case there are good members in it. So a steady state is really aggressive approach, takes that approach very aggressively, because it tries to keep as many of the old generation around as possible, assuming a lot of them are going to be good or worthy to keep around. The next option here, elitism, it takes that same strategy but makes it less aggressive, less severe. It says instead of keeping maybe 95% of our population around to preserve what's good, we'll keep a smaller percent around, maybe only 5% or 10% or half of the population. We can see this sort of being a spectrum or a sliding scale between the steady state and the elitism, where steady state keeps most of the generation around, elitism keeps a small number of the population around. We usually call this elitism because the people that we keep around, or the agents that we keep around, are the ones with the highest fitness, the best ones. Usually we keep those ones and we kill off the rest. But in both of these models, steady state and elitism, make sure that we maintain some of our population from the last generation does make it to the next generation. As a result of both of these strategies, you can have agents that live for very long, many generations. So a really good agent might be preserved for several generations, and as a result might be selected as a parent for many offspring, so might be able to produce many offspring in your model. Those three models are really the main models, but I've put a couple extra alternatives here that kind of cut across these models. So island models is the idea of saying, well, let's not just have one population. We're going to divide our population into smaller subpopulations, and we're going to employ these models in those subpopulations only. And then often there are rules about how maybe we might move from one population to another, some kind of migration as well. All that does is we can say on our islands we might use full replacement on all the islands, or on our islands we might use steady state on all our islands, or we might even vary from island to island. That might test the hypotheses about these different models. We might say some of our islands might do full replacement, some of them might do steady state, some of them might do elitism, and we might say, well, which islands end up evolving the quickest or have the most advantageous behaviors as a result of that. So island models cuts across these other ones, just a different way we can approach it. Again, a little bit more complicated. And then the final one I'm going to list here, I call it emergent, is one where we step away and we decide we don't really want to have a generational structure at all. We want to have kind of overlapping generations where this is more common in the natural world. So I mentioned, how seasonal plants have a very strict generational structure. But if we look at human beings or elephants or other sort of long-lived mammals, our generations tend to overlap and can be at very differing lengths. That's because we don't have, we don't have offspring all at one fixed time in the year. We don't all have offspring in the spring, and then we don't die as a result of having offspring, so we can have more offspring in future generations. And so you might think of the different families that you might know, maybe even in your own family. There can be certain families that have much longer generations. Maybe, they don't have children until they're about 30, 35, 40. And so the number of years between a parent, a child, a grandparent, parent, and child, and so on can be much longer than other family structures where you might have children when you're younger, maybe late teens, early 20s, and so you might have 2 or 3 different generations in the same time that another family structure might only have one. This is what we might call emergent generations, where the generations aren't dictated by the algorithm at all, but are instead something that pops out of the interaction of the agents in there. You often get emergent generational structures when you are relying more on natural selection than artificial selection. So natural selection is where we say, we don't pick who dies and who lives. The environment does. Something about the tasks and the behavior that they're performing determines who lives and who reproduces. Whereas in all these models that we've been looking at so far, who determines who lives and dies and who reproduces is us, the artificial selector, the individuals who are maybe creating the fitness function, we'll get to that in a second, and dictating based on that fitness function who lives, who dies, and who gets to reproduce. All right, so these are the different options we have. Again, we're trying to build a pretty simple evolutionary algorithm. So in my case study here, I'm going to elect for an elitism kind of structure, but I'm actually going to go for one that's sort of maybe dead in the middle between elitism and steady state. That is, we've decided on a population of 100 agents. I'm going to decide for my generational structure that we're going to keep 50 and kill 50. So at the end of each generation, we're going to kill off the 50 that are the least fit. We're going to use a fitness function to determine that. So the ones that are the furthest away from spelling my name, we will kill those ones off. And then we're going to use the remaining 50, the ones that we don't kill off. We're going to keep them around, so they're the elite. They're the ones that get to go to the next generation. But then we're also going to use them as parents to create 50 new offspring, and we're going to use them as parents to either mutate them or recombine them in kind of a crossover strategy to make new offspring. At the end, our next generation will have the 50 elite parents that we kept from the last generation, and then 50 offspring, new ones that we've created. Those offspring may be better or worse than the parents that we've kept around. So that's one of the reasons why we're going to rely on elitism here to make sure that if we have good members of the population, we'll keep them around so that they can still be there and reproduce, hopefully, in the next generation as well. So I've hinted now at reproduction a couple times. How do we carry out our reproduction in our evolutionary algorithms? Well, following natural selection and natural biological systems, there are sort of two obvious ways. We can either do asexual reproduction or we can do sexual reproduction that involves two agents blending their genetic material together. In our simulation, I haven't really decided whether I should use one or the other, so I'm going to say let's use both. Okay, and while this might not be super common in the biological systems that I study, certainly it is in some. It's not true of humans. We can only reproduce sexually, but there are many plants and animals out there, well, maybe not animals, plants, bacteria, and other living organisms that can reproduce both asexually and sexually. And so I'm going to decide that let's do that for our case study as well. And how are we going to decide if we want to do sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction? I'm just going to flip a coin. I'm going to use equal probability. When I'm generating an offspring, I'm just going to flip a coin. If it comes up heads, I'll say, okay, I'll do an asexual. In this case, if it comes up tails, I'll do sexual. So now when we do reproduce, we need to add variation into our genomes, right? If we perfectly copy our genome every time, we're not going to get any evolution. So we need to have some way to make random changes to it, deliberate or sometimes random. And so usually we characterize these as two different kinds of operations. We call them mutation and recombination. And recombination is sometimes called crossover when we're talking about sexual reproduction. So mutation is usually thought to be more of a random change to our genetic structure, whereas recombination is a way of taking our structure and, as it says, recombining it with something else. Recombination can mean recombining it with itself. That means maybe we copy parts of our string somewhere else. Or recombination also takes hold in sexual reproduction when we do crossover and we take two different genetic codes and we kind of line them up and we decide how we're going to copy from one or the other. So we're going to need to decide in our algorithm whether or how we're going to implement these two different mechanisms for our strings. So I'm going to start with mutation. And again, let's think of a particular string. So as an example, I'm going to say, let's start with the string string. Okay, it's just the string here. And when we have this string, we're going to call mutate on it, which means we maybe are going to change it in some way. And I'm going to have three possible ways that we might change the string. And each one of these is going to be possible every time we call mutate. So every time we want to mutate a string, we might add a character, we might delete a character, and we might replace a character. We might do all three of those, but we'll probably only do all three of those if we get really lucky, because each one of these we're only going to do with a small chance. So add a character, as we see here, it says with 5% chance, I'm going to add a random character to a random location. So my example here is the string becomes stbring. We randomly added a B in there between the T and the R. So that's one possible mutation that might occur. We randomly pick a position and we just stick a new character in that position. I've indicated here that I'm going to use a 5% mutation rate. So this is what we call the mutation rate in our algorithms. Mutation rate is one of the key parameters of an evolutionary algorithm, and we have to decide how much we're going to mutate. There's some rules of thumb in the evolutionary algorithm community about what good mutation rates might be worthwhile to use. It often depends a lot on your model, so your model might dictate different mutation rates, but we tend to want to keep our mutation rates kind of low. If you turn your mutation rate up too high, then the variation that you get in your population, you get too much chaos, too much randomness, that if you find something that's good, you won't be able to hold on to it. You won't be able to preserve it in your population, because in the next generation it will mutate and change into something usually worse. If you have something good and you mutate it, it usually gets worse, not better. And so for that reason, we try and keep our mutation rate pretty low, so that only small changes are made on each generation, hopefully preserving the good stuff and not making too many bad changes, while still having enough space that if we're lucky, we might get a good change as well along the way that we can preserve and push into the future. Okay, so that's why we've selected a 5%, but we can also imagine this being a parameter of our evolutionary algorithm that we might change and vary while we're running our algorithm to see what might be the best setting for it. For my example, I'm just going to use 5% because 5% is a go-to number for a lot of evolutionary researchers, because it's, like I said, small enough that it's not going to cause a lot of chaos in your population, but also big enough that you're going to see some changes that will hopefully take hold over time. So I already mentioned we're going to do three different possibilities here: add a character, delete a character, or replace a character. Delete a character is also fairly straightforward. You just pick a random character and just delete it out. So string becomes sting. In this example, we delete out the R. To replace the character, things are going to be slightly different. When we replace the character, I'm actually going to do this for each character. So for each character, I'm going to start with the S. I'm going to roll my random chance, my 5% chance. If it comes up true, yes, 5% true, then I will mutate it. In this example, I'm going to assume that maybe we went down the string str, those were all false, and then we got to I, and it became yes. And in that case, we changed the I. So it's sort of like doing a delete and an add all at the same time. We'll delete out the I and we'll replace it with the U, and we get a new word. String becomes strung in this case. So those are the three different kind of mutations that are going to be possible in our evolutionary algorithm. I've implemented each, and as I mentioned, each one can take hold in a single call of mutate. So we're going to randomly pick 5% each time for each one of these, and if we get lucky, we might hit each one. We might add a character, delete a character, and replace any number of characters as long as we get that 5% roll. Okay. Now keep in mind, if we change that 5% high enough, we could turn it all the way up to 100%, which I sometimes do when I'm testing my mutation rate just to see if it's working right. If I turn it all the way up to 100%, we would be doing all of these changes, and that would really radically change our string. Our string would not be string anymore afterwards. It would be a completely new string. So again, that's why we keep our mutation rate pretty low. Okay, so this is an example of mutation, but what about recombination? Well, I'm also going to introduce an idea of how we might cross over two strings. So crossover is a recombination mechanism that takes hold when we do sexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction means that we're going to have two strings or two genomes that we're going to be used to create the offspring genome. And we might call those mother and father, or string 1 and string 2, as I've done here. And as an example, I've just picked Marge and Homer from The Simpsons. And so let's assume here that Marge is one of our strings, Homer is the other string, and we've selected these two strings to reproduce. I've got a little pseudocode here of what we're going to do. We're going to repeat until a null character is selected. So as long as you keep selecting characters, you keep going. But if you ever select one that doesn't exist, you just stop. So what are we going to do? We're just going to randomly select the string to copy from, either the mother or the father, string 1 or string 2. And we're just going to copy that character and then move over to the next character. So in my first example here, we've lined up Marge and Homer here. And I'm going to imagine I'm flipping a coin, and I randomly picked Marge on my first one. So I'm going to copy the M instead of the H from Homer into my offspring. And I'm just going to keep doing this. On the next iteration, we might make another choice. And in this case, I pick string 2 maybe, and I pick the O instead of the A. And again, you can just imagine the pointer moving down. So now in the next iteration, we hit the R and the M. Okay, so I pick an R from Marge again. Maybe we pick the string 1 again, and randomly again, maybe we pick the E from Homer, and then maybe the last one we pick the R from Homer. And then if we kept going and we get to the next position, both of them have null characters in the next position. So if we get to the next position, we know we end. So the offspring we might create here is Morer, M-O-R-E-R, by blending these two strings together. So this is going to be crossover. It's going to create a lot more variation in our strings, because it's going to create strings that aren't just going to have one character changed, maybe like we might have from mutation, but in this case, Morer doesn't look like either Marge or Homer, and so it causes a lot more variation in our population, which is one reason why we like sexual reproduction in evolutionary algorithms, because it can help boost that variation bit. But sometimes it can be hard to come up with a very clever way to recombine two genomes. This was a fairly straightforward one. Why? Because we're dealing with strings that just line up easily, and we can kind of come up with this mechanism easy. Other genomes that might use integers or numbers, we have to come up with different ways to recombine them, and they don't always work. But this one seems fairly straightforward, and actually seems like it might be a useful one, and I haven't tested this in these examples. I haven't turned off sexual reproduction and see if that slows us down or anything, but I happen to think that this is a helpful one in our example. All right, we're almost at the end of the design stage here. What we need to do is we need to still come up with a way to evaluate our strings and determine if they're good or not. In our generational structure, the first step was delete the least fit strings. Well, how do we know if they're good or not? So how do we know if a string is closer to spelling my name than something else, some other string? Okay, so to do this, we need to develop a fitness function. In our example, we're going to be making what's called an artificial fitness function. If we were going to, in other examples, we might not use a fitness function at all, and in those cases, we would be relying on natural selection instead. We wouldn't define a fitness function determining which agents are better or worse. We would instead define rules of the environment for when reproduction is allowed to take hold, when death might take hold, and those rules are going to determine who reproduces or not some artificial fitness function. But we're going to use an artificial fitness function in this case because we have a very specific target in mind. We want to spell this string. So I'm going to have as a default, sort of built into my algorithm, this string, Christopher Palmariat, is going to be our default target string. And we're going to use this string in our fitness function to determine if other strings are close to it or not. And I've come up with a method of doing that. So first of all, we're going to take our string, whatever our other string is, and we're going to compare it to the target string, Christopher Palmariat. And we're going to do that in two different ways of comparison. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to compare their lengths. So I say here, let L be the difference in lengths between the two strings. And by difference, I mean the absolute value here. So we're going to, say we have another string that's smaller. We'll find the difference between them. We'll let that be L. M is going to be the number of incorrect characters between the two strings. So if we line the two strings up and we look at character 0, character 1, character 2, and so on, if they're the same, no penalty at all. But if they're different, we're going to count how many of the ones that are incorrect are different, and we're going to add those up, and we're going to call that number m. And then we're going to define the fitness of a string to be 2 times L plus m. Now, why did I pick this particular, why is it 2 times L plus m, not just L plus m? Well, when you develop fitness functions like this, you often have a range of fitness functions that you can pick from. Like I just mentioned, we could have L plus m or 2L plus m, or we could have half of an L plus m or L plus 2m. There's lots of different ways we could have weighted these two different components of our fitness function. I happen to choose this weighting 2L plus m only for one reason, and that is because by double penalizing the length, we actually inspire the strings to grow faster, to become longer faster. And once the string is long enough to spell my name, but not actually spelling my name, it has more options to actually be successful of replacing those characters with the right character. And so that's just an intuition that I have, that I thought this might be better. And in fact, if you implement this yourself, go ahead and try it. Delete the 2, just make it L plus m, and see if that makes your evolution go faster or slower. One interesting feature of this fitness function is that it is going to be 0 based, meaning the string Christopher Paul Marriott, the target string itself, will end up having a fitness of 0, because the difference in length will be 0 and the number of incorrect characters will be 0. So 2 times 0 plus 0 is 0. So the best possible fitness you can get in this model is 0, and all the other fitnesses, which are positive, higher fitness, are going to actually be worse in this model. So this is kind of an inverse fitness. Sometimes we think of fitness, the higher your fitness, the better. Well, in this model, the lower your fitness, the better. Sort of like golf, right? The lower your score is better. So we want to have lower fitness. And another way that I sometimes do this, if I have a fitness that's inverted like this, is I might just go ahead and say my fitness function is negative then. So make it minus 2L minus m, and then all of our numbers are negative, and then we can say, oh, 0 is the best, and it makes sense as well. All right, so let's just do a quick little example of this fitness function. So let's say we've got my more common name, Chris Marriott, that's what most people call me. Let's say we have that string and we want to compare it to my full name, Christopher Paul Marriott. So I've got a couple of measurements here. The length of Christopher Paul Marriott is 25. The length of Chris Marriott is 14. So L, 25 minus 14 must be 11. If you go and do a quick check mismatch, C-H-R-I-S, those ones are all correct, but the T, the O, the P, the H, the E, the R, the space, the P, the A, those ones are not, all of those are mismatched. So everything from space and Marriott is a mismatch. That's, Marriott has 8 characters, this plus the space is 9, so there are 9 mismatches between these two strings. And so the final fitness of Chris Marriott, at least according to this model, is 31. Okay, and I mentioned that we can use different fitness measurements. I had already hinted we could do this without the 2L. If we just did 1L plus m, the fitness of this would be 20, not 31. Okay, that sounds better, right? Another way is we could define a completely new fitness function. We didn't have to use these measurements. There's another one that I've used in the past called the Levenshtein edit distance that will respect that Marriott is actually supposed to be in this string, and it will say, hey, this is actually looks correct, we're just missing some middle bits. So other fitness functions might register Chris Marriott to be much closer to Christopher Paul Marriott because it's just missing some chunk in the middle. But because of the way that our fitness function works, when we started lining up the T, and we ended up lining the O up with the M, not with this M over here. We didn't sort of move it over to line it up with some other part, and as a result we got all mismatches in that part of the string. So different fitness functions might have different behaviors for our evolutionary algorithm. And it's worthwhile to try them out. One of the things we do usually vary a lot in preliminary experiments when we're doing evolutionary algorithms is our fitness function and the various weights that we might use on the components of our fitness function. So why am I sort of going on about this? Well, I just want to reiterate that this fitness function is somewhat arbitrarily chosen. It's not randomly chosen. I didn't just pick it out of the blue. I've I've made an educated guess. I've picked a fitness function that I think will be good for this particular evolutionary algorithm, but I think that other ones could be good too, and I've just picked this one arbitrarily out of a collection of ones that I thought might be good. All right, so my goal was not just to sort of describe an evolutionary algorithm, but actually show you it being, executed. So I've actually implemented this as a very simple website, and you can check out a link to that in the description below if you would like to play with this simulator yourself. And what I've got set up right now is this is our initial setup. This would be generation 0, okay, where we have our initial set of 100 strings here. These strings are all empty strings, so you can't actually see them right now. The string is going to be written the string, colon, and then its fitness. So right now what we have is a bunch of strings that have no characters in them at all, and all of those strings have fitness 50 according to our fitness function, which is 25 times 2, because the length difference between my target name, Christopher Paul Marriott, which is 25, and the empty string, which is 0, is 25. So 25 times 2 here is 50. And we can now carry out the first generation. Now I'm going to go slowly over the first generation to show what we're doing. So the first thing we're going to do, it tells us here what step we're on. The next step is to delete the least fit. So if I do that, it's now deleted out 50 of our elements. So you can see there's sort of 50 empty spots now. It's also kept our 50 elite. Those are the ones with the red boxes around them. Those are our 50 elite, the parents that were selected for the next generation. Well, because both of our groups, the parents and the non-parents, were all the same strings, we really don't have anything exciting here. But let's go through here as I generate. Next thing we need to do is add new offspring. So I'll do one step here. What we're seeing here is that this parent was selected, the red parent was selected, and we created the green offspring, and we called mutate, and we called, well, not crossover because we did asexual reproduction in this case, we only have one parent. We called mutate, but no mutate happened, or at least we didn't add a new character, which is the only one that's going to help us here if we add a new character. So I'm going to keep doing this. The next one, okay, this one indicates that we did sexual reproduction, so we have two parents selected, a red and a blue, but again, crossover with two empty strings doesn't really do anything. We also call mutate, so if we're lucky, we will have added a new character, but we won't. So let's just keep going until we see hopefully a helpful mutation occur. In this first generation, remember, we're only using 5% mutation rate, so the chance that we get one is kind of low. I'm hoping we get one in this example. There we go. Our first example where we've added the character P in. Okay, and you'll notice for this string, the fitness now is 49. And that's because we have now, the length of this string is now 1 instead of 0. So the difference between 25 and 1 is 24, so that's 48. But P is not equal to C, so because we didn't accidentally get the first letter, the one that we want, C, we also get a penalty for the mismatch, which gets us to 49. So let's keep going. Okay, here comes another lucky mutation. We get an L. Still not a C, so not necessarily one that's going to help us. But the length difference alone is enough to make it more fit. So we've now got to the end of creating our offspring. So the next step in our algorithm is to sort the population. So we're going to sort them by their fitness. So now that we've sorted them by their fitness, you'll notice that P and L have moved their way up into the top of the population. The rest of the strings, which are still all empty strings, are all have fitness 50, so they're all bumped to the bottom. What that means is we're going to preserve those two good ones in our population for next generation, because we're now on generation 1, and we're going to hopefully get more copies of them. So let's do the next generation. So again, step will delete those 50, and we'll go through again. Oh, we got lucky right away. On our first offspring, we picked one of those good parents as our parent, and we did do crossover, but we got lucky and we got the L, not the empty space. So we copied the L in. So now we end up getting two copies of this same agent. This agent, has now got a sibling or a cousin or a brother or whatever you want to think of it. This agent, this new L agent, if once it's been added to our population, is going to help us push into the future, into future generations, more strings that are more fit, because this one also has fitness 49. Let's keep going. Okay, we get some unlucky ones. We got lucky with a new mutation, added a new K in. We grabbed our P and got lucky, made another P. Grabbed P again, made another P. Aha, very lucky. We got a random mutation that created a C in the first position. And as I mentioned, C is the first letter of my name. So now the fitness of this one is 58. That's better than, or sorry, 48. That's better than our 49s. And maybe I'll just end at the end of this generation, or actually I'll do the sort, and we'll see, yeah, now look how we're now starting to gather at the top of our population strings that are better than the ones we had before. We've got C, the best one, and then we have a couple copies of P, we have a couple copies of L, and then we have this new K that just appeared this generation. Now I'm going to go a little bit quicker. I'm not going to step over each one. I'm just going to advance to the next generation and see what happens. So if we advance to the next generation, it looks like we got lucky and we got a couple copies of those C's. We got more copies of the P's. We got more copies of the L. We got more copies of the K. We actually got a new V in there as well. What you can see now is now that we have a lot of strings that are of length, of fitness 49, on the next generation, our chance of picking one of those strings as a parent is much higher. And so we're going to expect to see even more of those strings in the next generation. Sure enough, in the next generation now, we've almost filled up all of our elite. We still have some empty strings. Let's see about the next generation. Oh, with that many fitness 49, we've now pushed all the fitness 50 strings into the bad part of our population, so that now when we do our next step forward, we see, oh yes, we've eliminated all fitness 50. We're not going to see fitness 50 anymore. We might see it because of a random mutation, right? Like if we grab one of these P's, for instance, and we decide to accidentally delete it, we might get a new one with 50. But we know that those ones will always be on the low end of our population and will hopefully get filtered out every generation. Let's finish that generation off. And sure enough, we can see there are no more empty strings in this population. And further, we've started pushing forward our best strings. We've now got some 47s, these CP and CLs. I don't know where we got them from, but maybe we did a crossover with this TL, right? This TL with the CL maybe gives us one of the correct ones. So let's keep going and see how things go. This QR looks a little strange here, but I think what we've got here is maybe a space in front there. Oops, I'm pressing step. Let's do next generation. Next generation. Okay, next generation. Yeah, so let's look at these two here. Again, I think there's a space in front there. Why? Because then it would be space QR, and R is correct. And this one has CL, and the first C is correct. So both of them have a length of 3 and 1 correct character. That's why they're both in the first position there. So keep going here. Okay, what we saw there, I skipped past it, but let's look at the CLR. We must have got a crossover between those two good strings. The one that had the C in the right spot, the one that had the R in the right spot. And because we put them both in the right spot, now we've got an even better string. Okay, we can go next gen, next gen. At this point, we're starting to see the same thing happening, so I'm going to go ahead and click my run button, which is just going to run us one at a time. Actually, it goes one step at a time, so I'm going to speed us up a little bit here so we can see our generations go and see how long it's going to take us. I'm just going to put it on full speed here, see how long it might take us to spell my name. The pattern that we're seeing as we're going is there's evolutionary pressure for the strings to keep getting longer and longer and longer, because as they get longer, as they keep adding new characters, they are improving their fitness, but also there's pressure for them to get the right characters into the right spot. So it's interesting to note that our top our top winner here almost looks like it's spelling my name, Christopher Povg. The last couple are wrong, and sometimes, you know, some in the middle are wrong, but in this particular example, it looks like it's going very well. And it's sort of slowly growing out and finding the right characters for that name. So let's watch as it kind of finishes off here. Usually it takes about between 200 and 300 generations. We can see we're getting pretty close here. Manner, you see, you know, some are in the right spot, but not necessarily others. Okay, so some of the strings have two R's there, others do not. Okay, finally those two R's managed to make their way into the best string. Okay, we're getting really close now. Fitness 4, fitness 3. We just need one more character and a couple swatch. Okay, now we have all the right length. Okay, and now we're just missing that last T. And boom. So I have it set to stop when it reaches my name. And so it's got the very first character, the first occurrence of my fully spelt name on generation 323. Maybe I'll just zoom out a little bit so I can show you. We can still run it. We can do a next generation. And if we keep doing this, okay, not yet, but if we get lucky and select the fully spelt name, it should start propagating through the population. Okay, there we go. We start getting a couple copies, and even more, even more. If we keep doing this, eventually my name should take over the whole population. Oops, I keep hitting step by accident when it changes my size here. At least all the elite ones now spell my name. And what that means is on the next generation, so when we step through, all of them spell my name. So now when we go step, except for mutations, like that one got a mutation. Unfortunately, it got 2 mutations, it looks like. That one added a character. Ooh, adding a character is a terrible mutation. It inserted a character and shifted all the ones that were in the right spot over. So now we got a bunch of wrong ones. So that one's no good. So this is a good example of when you have a string that's already very optimized. So it's already the best that it can do. Any mutation you get is a detrimental mutation. So in this case, we changed the M to a Z, detrimental mutation. Okay, we got lucky, no mutation. That's the only way we get lucky now, no mutations. That's why having the mutation rate of 5% is good, because you want to make sure on some of these choices you're still getting no mutation at all. Okay, so I just did that to show, you know, in that last couple generations, we tend to fixate on the most fit agent. All right, I hope that this video helped you learn a little bit about evolutionary algorithms and how you might build an evolutionary algorithm yourself. You could easily implement this model yourself in your favorite language, or if you want, check out the link below and you can go check out the code that I wrote for my JavaScript implementation of it that you can see right here. So thanks a lot for watching, and I hope to see you in that next video.